Hey guys, Mr. P here. In this video, we're going to talk specifically about energy flow and not just how energy flows from the sun to Earth, which is obviously the source of the energy, but once it gets to Earth, we're going to talk about how producers, specifically autotrophs and photoautotrophs, utilize that energy kind of within them as an organism for an energy source, but ultimately how the energy flows through trophic levels on its way through the producers and ultimately ending up in our upper level consumers. So energy flows in a one-way direction from the sun through the organisms on the planet and is never returned to the sun. And so we refer to that as energy flow. Let's dive in. So in order to understand the importance of energy, we need to utilize an understanding, or we need to acquire an understanding of how the energy is actually utilized by the autotrophs. So the autotrophs are the organisms that are at the base of a food chain. We call those producers, and we need to kind of distinguish the two types of producers in environments and ecosystems found on the planet. And so one of those producers would be the producers that specifically utilize light as a food source or as an energy source to produce their own food. We call those photoautotrophs. Obviously, photo is a prefix meaning light. And so these are the plants and algae and some photosynthetic bacteria or photosynthetic prokaryotes that will ultimately use the photons that are sent to Earth from the sun in order to photosynthesize and thus make carbohydrates. But there are some environments and ecosystems on the planet that are completely void of light, meaning they are found on places or in places that can't that the sunlight just doesn't reach them. And so we call those specifically chemoautotrophs. The chemoautotrophs are the types of producers that will utilize chemical processing because they just don't have the photons available to them. These are areas like deep underwater, deep in the bottom of the ocean. They utilize a lot of the chemicals that are exuding from these hydrothermic vents and such in order to access an energy source and ultimately make the carbohydrates that they require. So two types of producers, one use light, one does not. The ones that use light are called photoautotrophs. The others that do not use light are called chemoautotrophs. Chemoautotrophs go through chemical processing, while photoautotrophs utilize photoprocessing or photosynthesis. I know that we've talked about photosynthesis in detail, and so if you need a refresher on what photosynthesis is, specifically in more detail, go back to those videos. But in order to kind of, again, further our understanding of energy flow within an ecological context, we need to familiarize ourselves or refamiliarize ourselves with the process of photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is a process, kind of a cellular energetic process that happens within a photoautotroph. And if you think about the equation, the organisms are going to be using sunlight as their energy source. Okay, photons are going to be oscillating and traveling along a predetermined wavelength, depending on which color of light, which we obviously would go into more detail within the photosynthetic unit. But these photons are particles that are oscillating along a particular wavelength. They're going to reach the cellular level of the leaf tissue, specifically the palisade mesophyll layer. Okay, that is the layer of the cell tissue that the chloroplasts acquire. It's the tissue that kind of contains most of the chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a pigment that is contained within the plants that makes them appear green. It reflects green light, absorbs all the others, and so these photons, which is the energy source that is sent by the sun, will be captured and absorbed by the chlorophyll pigments of the plant tissue. They will utilize that energy source to fix atmospheric carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, CO2. Plants also are going to bring in their other reactant, which is water. And so CO2, if I put a plus here, because these are the two reactants, carbon dioxide plus water are going into the plant, and once they are in, they're going to be utilizing the photons as an energy source to change these reactants into two products, which would be oxygen and sugars, specifically carbohydrates. Okay, so carbohydrates, specifically glucose would be made. Now, glucose is a monosaccharide, and plants have the ability to link these monosaccharides into chains called starch, but that's not really the focus of this lecture. So, this is kind of the overall basic overview of photosynthesis. Again, these would be the reactants, because they are the reactants of the photosynthetic equation. These would be considered the products, because they are being produced by the reactants and are therefore being released by the plant. Now, oxygen obviously is going to be released to the atmosphere. That's a byproduct of photosynthesis. And carbohydrates, it looks like it's coming out of the plant, but the carbohydrates that are made by photosynthesis are going to be utilized by the plants. But the reason they're kind of portrayed as coming out is because they are ultimately or also the source of energy for the consumers that will eventually or potentially eat the plants. And so there is kind of where the energy is going. So energy is obviously coming from the source, which is the sun. Energy is transferring through the plant and will eventually enter the consumers by way of consumption. Okay? When we start talking about the flow of energy from the sun into the producer and then ultimately to the consumers, we are starting to talk about food chains. And food chains can be both terrestrial and aquatic. The terrestrial food chain can be seen right here on the left, and the aquatic food chain, or an example of aquatic food chain, can be seen on the right. But food chains are demonstrating the flow of energy in a one-way direction from a producer organism all the way up to the top consumer. Food chains, for a variety of reasons, which we'll get to later in the lecture, can be of different lengths, but they can only reach a maximum length of 5 trophic levels. And what is a trophic level? A trophic level is the term used to refer to a feeding position. Each one of these organisms takes up or inhabits a different trophic level. They all have a different mode of consumption. Some of these are what we would consider herbivores. Some of these are what we would consider omnivores, and some would be considered carnivores. But when we look at a food chain, we have to kind of notice and appreciate the number of trophic levels present in the food chain. But things that food chains always have in common is they always start with a producer. In this terrestrial food chain, we will see that this particular plant is the producer. The grasshoppers in this case would be the first consumer. The bird would eat the grasshopper, and so that would be the second consumer. The snake would eat the bird, that would be our third consumer. And the owl would eat the snake, and so that would be a fourth consumer. Now, each of these consumers have different terms. The grasshopper would be considered a primary consumer. That is our first consumer. The bird would be the secondary consumer or second consumer. The snake would be a tertiary consumer or third consumer, and the owl would be a quaternary consumer, which would be the fourth level consumer. Okay, so producer, sometimes called primary producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, quaternary consumer. Now, as we will see later in the lecture, we will start to talk about how much energy is available at each trophic level, but that's coming in a little bit. So for now, know that trophic levels exist. There are different feeding positions or feeding relationships within a food chain, but all food chains show you which organisms eat which organisms, and ultimately the arrows will indicate the direction of energy flow from producer through our consumers. Okay? The direction of the arrow indicates the direction of energy flow. Now, cellular respiration and heat. We talked a little bit earlier in this lecture about the role of photosynthesis, and just as a repeat, remember the role of photosynthesis is to take the energy from the source, which was the sun, and convert it through our producers that can photosynthesize into a form of chemical energy, which are carbohydrates. Once our consumers consume the plant, or once the plant has made the carbohydrates, the plant or the consumers need to then use that chemical energy, which is glucose in the form of those carbohydrates, and it needs to turn that ultimately into an energy source that the plant or the other organisms can use, and that energy source is in the form of ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. that is the form of cellular energy that all of your cellular bioprocessing can use and does utilize for a lot of the cellular energetic and biochemical processing. So this process, cellular respiration, again, I have other videos that go into much more depth about cellular respiration, including glycolysis and prep step and Krebs cycle and ETC and chemiosmosis. And if you want a refresher on those, go see those other videos. But for now, we just need to kind of talk holistically and kind of big picture wise about what mitochondria's role and what specifically cellular respiration's role is in the flow of energy. This cellular respiration process is going to take place specifically in the mitochondria. Okay, mitochondria is an organelle in eukaryotic cells that processes the glucose and oxygen as reactants. Okay, they are our fuel sources, and the mitochondria will use these fuel sources or these inputs and will produce large amounts of ATP as long as oxygen and anaerobic environments are possessed, and will produce these waste products of carbon dioxide or CO2 plus water. Both of these are released through expiration or exhalation. Every time you breathe out, you're breathing out carbon dioxide and water vapor, and the source of those is obviously coming from this cellular respiration process. So as a consumer, we eat glucose, we eat producers, or we eat organisms that ate producers, and we thus gain glucose. We also inhale oxygen every time we inhale, and so we are mixing these fuel sources in our mitochondria to produce ATP. Now, one of the byproducts of this process and one of the inefficiencies of this process is that there is large amounts of heat generated, and this heat is essentially kind of dissipated to the atmosphere. And one of the kind of the benefits of releasing this energy to the atmosphere is that it helps to maintain our core body temp. We are endoderms, okay, so we're warm-blooded organisms. That means we release energy to our environment or to our atmosphere. We don't have to bask or warm our bodies like reptiles do in order to kind of speed up our metabolism, which is why they're doing it. We can produce our own heat. We are warm-blooded organisms, and the reason we're producing heat is because we have inefficiencies with our cellular respiration pathways. And so we're constantly releasing heat. Now, how or where does this energy go? Now, I'm using a hummingbird to kind of be a model organism in this case, but really any heterotrophs or any consumers would follow the same kind of blueprint. This hummingbird, for instance, is going to consume organic materials for energy, specifically nectar. Okay, you've probably seen hummingbirds out around your house. They travel from flower to flower. They're feeding on the nectar, and one of the reasons why they can move the way they do is so that they can basically hover fairly steady and motionless, in one flower or in one area for a long time, so that they can ingest the nectar from the flower in a really efficient way. So whatever the heterotroph or consumer consumes, we're going to call that 100% of the energy available to the organism, because the energy isn't created, right? The hummingbird has to gain the energy from external sources, and so it doesn't matter if the hummingbird ate 1 gram of nectar or if the hummingbird ate 100 grams of nectar. It's still going to be or kind of correlate to 100% of the consumed organic material. The organic material is consumed, and so that makes up the 100%. Now, because the hummingbird has to live and has to move and contract its muscles, it has to send nerve impulses, it has to break down its materials that it consumed, it has to build up biological biomass, it has to communicate, it needs to maintain its body temperature. All of those things require energy, and it's going to utilize roughly 25% of the energy that it consumed to just sustain its life. To keep itself alive, it has to consume 25% of the energy that it consumes. Okay, it takes us 25% of the energy we consume to keep us alive. So that 25% is literally just life preservation. We don't store energy in that. We don't waste energy in that. That is literally the amount of energy it takes us to live. So Of the 100% of energy that we consumed, 25% is used by us as the consumer in order to sustain our life. That means we have roughly 75% of the energy we consumed remaining. Because we just talked about heat or thermal energy being produced by inefficiencies associated with cellular respiration, 65%, over half, of the energy we consumed will never be utilized by us as an organism. We are going to lose, right off the top, 65% of the energy that we consume to our environment. That just keeps us warm-blooded, and we basically lose that to our environment. Okay? Heat is constantly being shed from us to our environment, so it's lost. So, if we had 75% of energy remaining after the life preservation biochemical processing is complete, 65% is lost as heat, we have roughly 10% remaining. Now, that 10% is going to be lost to other inefficiencies, such as some things that we eat are simply not going to be digested or not going to be absorbed and are going to be excreted or egested through feces or urine. Some parts of organisms are going to go uneaten, like if you're talking about in a carnivore, sometimes they leave bones, sometimes they leave fur, sometimes they don't consume the beak, of a prey item. So some of the organisms that the carnivore consumes is not going to be consumed, and so roughly 10% is lost. Now, you'll notice that there is a color coding to this kind of chart. The red boxes are completely lost. So 75% of the energy you consumed is going to eventually be lost to the environment and not used. 100%, obviously, the heterotrophs in blue, this is the organism consuming 100% of the material it eats. And then the green is green is on purpose, because the green is what the organism has to use in order to keep itself alive. Okay, so where does the heat go? The heat goes to the environment, and because we are losing most of our heat or most of our energy to the environment, it is not going to be transferred from one trophic level to another. Okay? If that hummingbird that we just talked about loses 65% of its energy that it consumed as heat to its environment, if a cat came along and was able to catch and eat the hummingbird, it's not going to regain or recapture the 65% of energy that the hummingbird already lost to its environment, because again, that's what lost to its environment means. It's completely gone. Okay? So, how much energy is actually transferred from one level to another? Again, we've already talked about the sun being the ultimate source of energy, and it's no different here. All of the energy in any ecosystem across the globe, no matter where it is or what biome, is going to come from the sun. The sun is going to send its energy to the producer level. The producer level will lose 65% of its energy to the environment. It will also utilize the 25% to keep itself alive. And so 10% is the only amount of energy that will be transferred to the next trophic level. Okay? So 10% is transferred to our primary consumers. 10% of that is transferred to our secondary consumer. 10% of that to our third level consumer, and 10% of that is transferred to our apex predator or our fourth level consumer. There is a reason why trophic levels and food chains can only be 5 trophic levels long, and that is because by the time you get to the 5th trophic level, the amount of energy available to those organisms is 1/100th of a percent from all of the energy available to that food chain when it enters the first level, trophic level, right? So of 100% of energy available at the primary producer level, only 1/100th of a percent will actually reach the apex predator. And so that's why it's shaped like a pyramid. It consistently gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and sometimes you'll see it depicted like this. Energy pyramids will basically be kind of boxy. They won't follow the actual kind of symmetrical shape of like an isosceles or equilateral triangle. it'll show roughly a box above it that is 1/10 of the size of this. The next one will be roughly 1/10 of the size of this one. This one will be roughly 1/10 the size of this one, and this one will be roughly 1/10 the size of that one. And so you'll see it kind of pinch in very quickly, and so that's to depict in a more realistic way the amount of energy that is available to the next trophic level. It is, again, only 10% transferred to the next trophic level. Well, why is it only 10%? Because, like we said, roughly 65% will be lost in this level, and then 65% will be lost in this level, and then 65%, 65%. Okay? And if most of the energy is being lost as heat, well, then we just don't have much energy to transfer. Okay? One thing that I need to talk about is that most of the time when you see these energy pyramids, the units that they are going to be specifying on the amount of energy that is available at each levels will be in the unit. It's kilojoules per area per unit time. Okay, so kilojoules per meter per year is typically the units. Okay, now I just kind of showed you this. These would be kind of the boxy type pyramids that I showed you. But while the energy pyramid is typically the main form of pyramid that is shown, sometimes you will also see biomass or number pyramids. Now, biomass and number pyramids are not going to follow the same 10% rule that the energy pyramid did. Again, energy pyramid has to show you or has to follow the 10% rule always. The biomass and the numbers pyramid are exactly what it sounds like. Biomass is the actual amount of weight per unit squared. And so this would be the amount of actual physical biomass, okay, the weight per meter squared of each of these trophic levels in a particular ecosystem or in a particular food chain. Okay, so this would be depicted by weight. This would be depicted by actual numbers, so it doesn't take into consideration energy, it doesn't take into consideration the weight of the organisms, it specifically talks about the number of organisms at each of those levels. So this would be more like a census, where you go out and you physically count the number of organisms that belong to the producer level, the primary consumer level, the secondary and the tertiary consumer level. And you'll notice that in all of these pyramids, they all follow the same kind of pattern. Obviously, the energy pyramids are going to show you a 10% rule, are going to follow a 10% pattern. But the pattern is that each trophic level has to be reduced in some way. Okay, so whether you're looking at biomass, there's always smaller amounts of biomass as you get towards the top of a food chain. And when you talk about the numbers, there's always a decrease in the number of organisms that that progress in a food chain. Okay. And then kind of a last way to show you kind of how nutrients cycle but energy flows. Here is kind of a really simple depiction of that. One thing that I would like to ultimately highlight is that energy flows and nutrient cycle. Okay, nutrients cycling being in green. Nutrient cycling are going to always start and end with the producer level, but energy doesn't cycle, and the reason it doesn't cycle is that energy is never sent back to the sun. We already said that sunlight or the sun is the ultimate source of energy, and so if energy cycled, just like in any other cycle, the energy would have to return to the sun, and we know that it does not. So energy is going to enter our system from sunlight. Autotrophs, which are the plants that photosynthesize, are going to capture the sunlight with their pigments, specifically chlorophylls. Energy is then going to flow through the trophic levels from primary producer all the way through our fourth level consumer. Approximately 10% of each, or 10% of the energy available at each level is going to be passed on to the next trophic level. Energy loss at each level is due to materials being not either assimilated into the cell, basically not being absorbed, or egested through feces or excreted through feces. Energy passes through ultimately decomposers, detritivores, saprotrophs. These are the fungus and earthworm type organisms that are going to decompose our nutrients or the energy and nutrients from an organism that has passed. And ultimately, heat energy is lost through cellular respiration all along every step of the way, and roughly 65% at every step. Okay. Once it's lost to the environment, it's lost and will eventually be just lost to the atmosphere. Okay. So energy flows in a one-way direction from the sun through all of our trophic levels and will eventually be lost to the environment, which is, it's good for us that the sun is constantly sending energy to us. Now, nutrient cycle is a little different. Nutrient cycle within ecosystems, and nutrients are always recycled. They are never lost to our environment. Nutrients can be released from the weathering of rocks, specifically like phosphorus and nitrogen. Nutrients are recycled through the decomposition of dead organisms. Nutrients move through food chains by digestion of other organisms. Nutrients are absorbed by the producer level, specifically the plants, through their roots. And so once the producers gain the nutrients from the soil, they will use those within their biomass. Consumers will come along and will eat the producers and will transfer the nutrients to the consumers. Eventually the consumers die. Decomposers will release those nutrients back to the environment where the producers again can absorb them. So nutrients are always recycled and are cycling through our trophic levels and environments, whereas energy is constantly being flown from the sun to our producers and then ultimately through all of our consumers, but will always eventually be released to the environment and will be lost forever. Hopefully you learned something. This is energy flow through environments and through organisms, specifically through food chains and food webs. Bring your questions to class. Bye.